"You have until sundown to put those children on the road," Mayor Aldrich said, his voice carrying across the frozen churchyard like a final verdict. "Or I'll have the deed transferred by morning." Clara Whitmore didn't step back. She pulled the door tighter behind her so the children inside couldn't hear what came next. "Then you'll have to walk through me first," she said. The mayor looked at the 7 small faces pressed against the frost-covered window and felt nothing. Clara felt everything. If this story already has your heart, you're exactly who this channel was made for. Subscribe right now, hit that bell, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Black Hollow, Montana, 1881, and find out what one woman's refusal cost her and what it ultimately saved. The explosion happened on a Tuesday. Nobody in Black Hollow would ever forget the sound of it. A low, terrible thunder that rolled up from the Garnet Ridge mine shaft and shook every window on Main Street. 41 men went down into that earth that morning. 19 of them never came back up. The widows were given 3 weeks to clear out of company housing. The children were given nothing at all. Clara Whitmore learned about the first child on a Wednesday evening when she found a boy sitting on the front steps of her boarding house with no coat on and a burlap sack across his knees. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His name was Thomas. His father had been one of the 19. His mother had died the previous spring from fever. He had no aunts, no uncles, no one in Black Hollow who claimed him. He wasn't crying when Clara found him. That was the part that broke her open. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Thomas looked at her the way a child looks at something he desperately wants, but has been punished before for wanting. Cautious, measuring the distance between hope and disappointment. "I don't want to be a bother," he said. Clara took the burlap sack from his hands and brought him inside. She fed him what she had, half a pot of bean soup and the last of her cornbread, and she made up a cot near the stove. She told herself it was temporary. 1 night, maybe 2, while she figured out what to do. But the next morning, Thomas's younger sister appeared at the door. Her name was Ruth. She was 6. She had followed her brother's footprints through the snow for nearly a mile and a half because nobody had told her where else to go. Clara let her in. By the end of that first week, there were 4 children living in the boarding house. By the end of the second week, there were 7. She didn't plan it. She didn't announce it. She simply could not look at a child standing in the cold and close the door. But Black Hollow noticed. The first sign came from Margaret Holt, who ran the dry goods store on the south end of Main Street and had sharp eyes for anything she considered a disruption to the natural order of things. Margaret stopped Clara on the boardwalk one afternoon and folded her hands in front of her chest, the way women do when they've already made up their minds. "You know what you're doing is going to attract trouble," Margaret said. "Children without family background, nobody knows where they've been, what they've carried in with them. Diseases, bad habits. You start collecting strays, Clara, and the whole town pays the price." "They're children, Margaret, not stray dogs." "I'm only saying what others are already saying." "Then they can say it to my face." Margaret's expression tightened the way a fist does. "Don't be foolish. You're a widow, living alone. You have no income beyond what that boarding house brings in. The moment decent folk decide they'd rather not sleep under the same roof as a house full of orphans, and they will decide that you'll have nothing." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "I already had nothing," she said. "Turns out it's a lot easier to carry when you're not carrying it alone." She walked away before Margaret could answer. That was her first mistake according to Black Hollow. Not taking in the children. The first mistake was refusing to be ashamed of it. The paying boarders began leaving within the month. First, the traveling salesman who'd rented the large corner room. Then the schoolteacher who'd been there since September. Then the 2 brothers who worked the lumber contracts and had always paid on time and never asked for anything. One by one, the rooms emptied. One by one, the income dried up. Clara started skipping dinner so the children could have enough. She told herself she wasn't hungry. She got very good at telling herself that. The town's whispers grew teeth around the time the railroad investors started arriving. Black Hollow had spent 3 years courting the attention of the Continental Western Railway Company, and now that attention had finally arrived in the form of 2 men in wool overcoats who walked through town taking notes in leather-bound journals. Everything in Black Hollow that winter was about impression, about appearances, about convincing men with money that this was a place worth investing in. And there sat Clara Whitmore's boarding house, slightly crooked on its foundation, full of children who ran too loud and laughed too sudden and tracked mud across the front porch. A building that had no business being the first thing a railroad investor saw when he turned off the main road. Mayor Gerald Aldrich came to see her on a Thursday morning. He was not a cruel man by nature. Clara had always understood that about him. He was the kind of man who did cruel things through convenience, through the slow, comfortable practice of deciding that certain inconveniences simply mattered less than others. He stood in her front room with his hat in his hands and his jaw set with the particular stiffness of a man who had already written the ending before the conversation started. "Clara," he said, "I'll come straight to it. The Harlan investors are arriving next week for their final assessment. The board has concerns. About the children. About the property. About the signal it sends a boarding house in that condition full of unclaimed minors with no legal structure. They have legal structure. They have me." Aldrich paused. "You have no formal appointment, no papers, no license from the territory. From a legal standpoint, those children are unsupervised." Clara felt something cold move through her chest, but she kept her voice even. "From a legal standpoint," she said quietly, "those children lost their fathers in a mine explosion that your business partners were warned about for 2 years before the shaft collapsed. If we're talking about legal standpoints, Mayor, I'd be careful about which ones you'd like to open up." The silence between them went tight as a wire. "There is an orphan train scheduled through in 6 weeks," Aldrich said, his voice carefully flat. "The territorial office would place them in proper homes. Christian homes. Families with means. Families who take children off trains for farm labor," Clara said. "That's not placement. That's the same thing in different clothes." "Clara, I know what happens to those children, Gerald. I have read the letters. I have spoken to the missionaries who follow those trains. Half of those children end up working fields they'll never own in houses they'll never belong to. They don't get families. They get labor contracts with smaller hands." Aldrich put his hat back on. The conversation in his mind was over. "I'm giving you until the investors leave town," he said. 6 weeks. If you cannot demonstrate a legal framework for this arrangement, funding documentation, a proper charter, the town council will exercise its right to remove the children to territorial care and reclaim this property under Ordinance 12. Clara stood very still. "You want to take my home. I want to solve a problem before it costs this town a railroad contract worth $100,000. And the children aren't the problem. The appearance of disorder is the problem. Then maybe," Clara said slowly, "the problem is what Black Hollow considers disorder." He left without answering. She stood at the window and watched him walk back toward Main Street. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything on the outside of her was steady because she had learned in the 3 years since her husband Robert died and left her this half-broken boarding house, and nothing else, that the outside of a person is the only armor they can count on. Inside, she was terrified. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to find money she didn't have. File papers she didn't know how to file, and convince a town that had already decided against her that these 7 children deserved to stay. She turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen. Thomas was already awake, setting the table without being asked. He did that every morning now, quietly, carefully, the way a child does who is afraid that if he stops being useful, someone will notice and reconsider him. "Is everything all right, Miss Clara?" he asked. She looked at him. 8 years old, still wearing a coat 2 sizes too large because it was the only one she'd been able to find. His sister Ruth was asleep on the cot in the corner. Beside her 4-year-old Daniel curled around a corncob doll like it was the only solid thing in the world. Across the room, the 3 older children, Nora, Sam, and the quiet, watchful twins who still hadn't told anyone their real names were beginning to stir. 7 children. 7 small people who had been handed the worst possible start to the worst possible winter, and who still every single morning woke up and tried again. "Everything's fine," Clara said. "Wash your hands. Breakfast is almost ready." She went to the stove and told herself she wasn't going to cry. She was almost right. The first week after Aldrich's visit, Clara wrote 4 letters to the Methodist Mission Office in Helena, to the Territorial Charity Board, to 2 former boarders she'd hoped might serve as character references, and to her late husband's brother in Ohio, who had never responded to a single correspondence in 3 years. None of them answered within the week. Nora, who was 13 and sharp as a tack, and far too old in the eyes for her age, found Clara at the writing desk at midnight on Thursday and stood in the doorway in her nightgown. "You're worrying about the mayor," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "Go back to bed." "I heard what he said. The walls in this house aren't as thick as you think." Clara set down her pen. "How much did you hear?" "Enough." Nora came and sat across from her at the table, tucking her feet up under her, the way she always did, like she was folding herself into something smaller. "We've been moved before, Miss Clara, me and Sam, 3 times since our mother died. We know how it goes." Clara felt the words like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "This isn't going to be the same." "You say that." "I mean it." Nora looked at her with those 2 old eyes. "The last woman who meant it, she meant it right up until she didn't. And then it was the county house, and then it was the train, and then it was a farm in Nebraska, where they didn't even bother learning our names." The silence held everything Clara didn't know how to answer. "I'm not her," she finally said. "I know," Nora said. Then very quietly, "That's why I'm scared too." She went back to bed. Clara sat at the desk for a long time, not writing anything, just listening to the sound of 7 children breathing in the dark and thinking about what it costs a person to trust someone again after the world has broken that trust down to splinters. The second week brought the first act of open hostility. Someone threw a rock through the boarding house window on a Saturday night. It landed on the kitchen floor and scattered glass across the boards, and 4 of the 7 children woke up screaming before Clara could get to them. She spent 20 minutes in the dark telling them they were safe, which was the thing you say when you don't know yet whether it's true. She found a note tied to the rock in the morning. It said, "Send them away before we send you away." She burned the note in the stove so the children wouldn't see it, but Thomas had already seen it. "Miss Clara," he said from across the kitchen, "if we leave, will they leave you alone?" She turned around slowly. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his chin up, trying very hard to look like someone making a mature decision and failing in the way only an 8-year-old can fail, with the full catastrophe of childhood emotion visible just beneath the surface. "Nobody is leaving," Clara said. "But if it's because of us—" "Thomas?" She crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of him so they were eye level. "Listen to me carefully. The reason they want you gone has nothing to do with who you are and everything to do with who they are. Do you understand the difference?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. Then, "Not really. It means this isn't your fault. It's not something you did. It's something they're choosing to do. And you don't have to carry their choice. That's not yours to carry." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his chin wobbled exactly once, and he pressed his lips together and held it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. She stood up and he went back to his breakfast, and neither of them said anything else about it, because sometimes that's all the ground 2 people can cover in one conversation, and it still counts as enough. The third week. 2 things happened. The first, a lawyer named Prescott arrived from Helena with papers that Clara had not sent for, delivered on behalf of someone whose name was listed only as a private donor. The papers were a formal petition for a territorial children's shelter license, already drawn up, already notarized, needing only her signature and 2 witnesses. She stood in the doorway reading them 3 times because she couldn't quite make herself believe they were real. "Who sent these?" she asked. Prescott removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate patience. "I'm not at liberty to say. My instructions were to deliver the documents, assist you through the filing, and ensure the process moves before the month is out. Someone hired you to help me. Someone hired me to ensure the paperwork was correct, he said. Whether that helps you is between you and the territorial board. She signed the papers that afternoon with Margaret Holt and the Reverend as unwilling witnesses. Margaret because Clara walked directly into her store and asked her in front of 4 customers, which made it impossible to refuse without looking petty, and the Reverend because he was a man who believed in legal process, even when he wasn't sure he believed in the cause. The second thing that happened in that third week, a man rode into Black Hollow on a gray horse and didn't say much to anyone. Clara only noticed him the way you notice weather peripherally, a shift in the quality of the air. He came into the boarding house looking for a room hat in hand, trail-worn and quiet, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to take up as little space as possible. His name was Elias Reed. He paid 2 weeks in advance with exact coin, asked no questions, and went upstairs. She had 4 empty rooms. She rented him the one farthest from the children. She told herself it was because he seemed like a man who valued quiet. She was not wrong about that. She didn't know yet that she was also completely wrong about almost everything else. By the end of the third week, the town had escalated. A petition with 47 signatures was delivered to the council, demanding the orphan house be cleared before the investors made their final decision. 2 more rocks hit the building, one through the front window again, one through the wall of the barn where Clara kept her one remaining mule. The council voted 4-1 to move forward with Ordinance 12 proceedings if Clara could not produce verified funding and a territorial license within 30 days. 30 days. Prescott told her the territorial board could take 60. She sat with that arithmetic for a long time. That night, after the children were asleep, she went out to the back of the property to chop wood because the stove had burned through the last of the split pile, and she needed to do something with her hands before she came apart at the seams. The axe was heavy, and the wood was frozen, and her palms were already raw from the cold, but she swung it anyway, over and over, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating odds she didn't want to face. She didn't hear him until he was right behind her. "You're going to hurt yourself," Elias Reed said quietly from somewhere just past her left shoulder. She spun around, axe still in hand. He was standing about 6 feet back, both hands visible with the particular careful posture of a man who knows better than to startle someone already on edge. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked at the pile of unsplit wood, and then at her hands, and then back at the wood. "I'll do it if you want. Or I won't. Either way." She stared at him. He waited. There was something in the quality of his patience that she couldn't quite locate. Not indifference, not performance. Just a stillness that felt like it had cost him something to earn. "The axe is against the stump when I'm done," she finally said, and walked back inside. When she woke up the next morning, the wood was split and stacked more of it than she'd had all month, enough to last 3 weeks. And Elias Reed was already gone to wherever he went in the mornings. She stood at the back window looking at it for a long time. Then, Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Who did that?" he asked. Clara thought about answering. "I don't know yet," she said. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she almost smiled. She found out his name from the register, and she found out almost nothing else. Elias Reed. That was what he'd written in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the kind of penmanship a person teaches themselves late in life, because no one taught them early. No town of origin, no forwarding address. Just a name and 2 weeks of coin exact to the cent. He came down for breakfast the next morning at the same time as the children, which she hadn't expected, and the children hadn't expected either. Thomas stopped mid-sentence. Ruth pressed herself against the wall near the stove. The twins, who still hadn't offered their names to anyone, stared from across the table with the flat animal assessment of children who have learned that new adults are a variable, not a constant. Elias sat down at the far end of the table and didn't say a word. He didn't try to introduce himself. Didn't try to make anyone comfortable. He poured his own coffee from the pot on the table, wrapped both hands around the cup, and looked out the window with the focused calm of a man who has eaten 100 meals in rooms that didn't want him there. Thomas watched him for 30 seconds. Then, "You split the wood." Elias looked at him. I did. Why? A pause. Not the pause of someone searching for the right answer. The pause of someone deciding whether the honest answer will land well or badly. It needed splitting, he said finally. Thomas seemed to find this acceptable. He went back to his biscuit. Ruth, emboldened, slid into the chair, 2 down from Elias, and stared at him with the shameless curiosity of a 6-year-old. Are you a cowboy? She asked. I've worked cattle. Do you have a horse? Yes. What's his name? Another of those pauses. Gray. Ruth made a face. That's not a very good name. He doesn't seem to mind. Thomas snorted into his biscuit. Even Nora, standing against the far wall with her arms folded and her expression locked into the controlled suspicion she wore, like armor, pressed her lips together over something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Clara watched all of it from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. She didn't know what she was watching yet. She only knew it was something she hadn't seen in 3 weeks, something loose and unguarded, moving through the tight, defended space her household had become. Something that felt almost like ordinary life. She was wise enough not to trust it. But she was also honest enough to notice it. The town wasted no time noticing him first. By mid-morning, Margaret Holt had already assembled 3 opinions about Elias Reed without speaking to him once. He was an outlaw. He was hiding from a warrant in Texas. He had killed a man in a card dispute in Cheyenne and ridden north to disappear. By afternoon, the story had grown a body count and a specific county. By evening, the general consensus on Main Street was that Clara Whitmore had not only filled her house with orphaned children, but had now opened her door to a dangerous drifter, and that the 2 facts together constituted a pattern of judgment so poor it practically made itself illegal. Aldrich sent his deputy, a young man named Colt Ferris, to the boarding house that afternoon, with a face full of reluctant authority and a notebook he didn't open once. The mayor wants to know about your new boarder, Ferris said, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. My boarders are a private matter, Clara said. There's been some concern. There's always some concern. Who is concerned specifically and about what specifically? Ferris shifted his weight. Ma'am, people are saying he's got a record. Do you have a record of his record? No, ma'am, but. Then you have a rumor. And I don't run my boarding house on rumors. She looked at him steadily. Was there anything else? He left without writing anything in the notebook. Inside, behind the window, Thomas watched the whole exchange with wide eyes. He came because of Mr. Reed. He came because people in this town have too much time on their hands, Clara said, and went back to the kitchen. But she thought about it. Of course she thought about it. She was a widow running a half-funded shelter under legal threat, and she had rented a room to a man whose history she did not know, based on nothing more than exact coin and a pile of split wood. That was not by any rational standard a sound decision. She went upstairs and knocked on his door that evening. He opened it after the second knock, still dressed, coat still on, like he hadn't been expecting to stay in one place long enough to take it off. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need a straight answer. All right. Is there anything about your past that's going to bring trouble to this house? He looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that isn't searching for the question, but sitting with it. Define trouble, he said. Law trouble. No warrants. No outstanding charges. Nothing that would hold up before a judge. That's a very precise way to answer that question. It's a precise question. She studied him. Have you done things you're not proud of? Yes, he said without hesitation. Not defensive, not ashamed. Just a statement of fact, the way a person acknowledges weather. Have you hurt people who didn't deserve it? Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had settled in over a long time and stopped being acute. I've made decisions that cost people I shouldn't have cost. That's not what I asked. No, he said. It's not. He looked past her for a moment at nothing visible. Then, the people I hurt, they were people who were trying to hurt others first. That's not a clean answer. I know that. But it's the true one. Clara held his gaze. She'd gotten very good at reading the difference between honesty and performance over 3 years of running a boarding house full of strangers. She couldn't find the seam in him. "The children stay downstairs," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you gave them space to decide whether or not they trust you. Don't push it either direction." "Understood." She started to turn away. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice stopped her. "The papers from Helena. The license filing." She turned back slowly. "I heard what the deputy said to you last week," Elias said. "Through the floor. These walls aren't thick. Yes, I'm aware. Yes, The territorial board has a secondary process. Emergency charter. It takes 10 days instead of 60 if you can demonstrate imminent risk of harm to the children under current arrangements." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper and held it out to her. "That's the statute number and the filing office address. In Helena." She took it, looked at it. The handwriting was the same careful, self-taught script as the register. "How do you know this?" she said. His jaw moved slightly. "Because I spent 6 months trying to figure out why nobody used it when I was 10 years old," he said. "And then I figured out it was because nobody was looking for a way to keep us." He closed the door. Clara stood in the hallway for a full minute before she walked back downstairs. She did not sleep well that night. She didn't have to look for the next problem. It found her on Thursday. 2 of the railroad investors, a heavy-set man named Gideon Harland and his associate, a thin man with a pocket watch. He checked every 4 minutes, came to the boarding house. Not to speak to her, to walk past it slowly on the opposite side of the street, making notes in their leather journals, and speaking to each other in low voices while they looked at the building the way you look at something you've already decided is in the wrong place. Nora watched them from the upstairs window. "They're measuring," she said flatly. "Measuring what?" Sam asked from beside her. "Distance. To the main street. To the new platform they're planning to put in." She stepped back from the window. "They want this land." Clara kept her voice level. "You don't know that." "Miss Clara!" Nora turned around with those flat, knowing eyes. "I've been moved 3 times. I know what it looks like when someone walks around a property trying to figure out how to take it." The silence that followed had enough weight in it to hold water. Clara wrote to Prescott that afternoon. She sent the telegraph herself, walking down Main Street past Margaret Holt's store and the 3 men sitting outside the saloon who went quiet when she walked past. She handed it through the window at the telegraph office without looking at the young man behind the counter, because she knew he'd read it before the day was out, and the whole town would know its contents by Sunday. She sent it anyway. The message said, "Need to discuss emergency charter process. Urgency has increased. Please advise." She walked home the long way through the alley behind the feed store because she was not in the mood to perform composure for an entire main street. She almost made it. She was 2 blocks from home when she heard the voices, 3 of them coming from the far end of the alley. She recognized 2 by sound before she saw faces. Cal Brewer, who ran the tannery and had been the loudest signature on the petition, and Price Dunham, who was on the town council and owed Harlan's company a private debt she wasn't supposed to know about. The third voice she didn't recognize. "Doesn't matter what the board says," Dunham was saying. "If the license doesn't clear before the investors finalize, the property reverts under the ordinance. And if someone were to make sure the filing gets delayed..." "You can't interfere with a territorial filing," Brewer said. "You can if you know the right clerk. Helena isn't sending marshals to check paperwork timelines for a charity house in a mining town." Clara stopped walking. She pressed herself against the wall and stood very still and listened to 2 men she had lived next to for 6 years discuss casually how to falsify a government processing delay in order to steal her home. Her chest went cold. Her mind went very clear. She turned around and walked back the way she'd come, faster now, and she did not stop until she reached the boarding house and went directly to the kitchen and stood at the sink with both hands gripping the edge of it, breathing. Thomas appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later. He was getting good at finding her when something was wrong. "Miss Clara." "I'm all right." "You don't look..." "I said I'm all right, Thomas." She softened it immediately because it wasn't his fault and he didn't deserve the edge of it. I'm sorry, I just need a minute. He stood in the doorway, uncertain. Then he went to the stove and poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter beside her without saying anything. She looked at it, then at him, 8 years old, setting the table every morning without being asked, pouring coffee for a grown woman who'd just come apart at the seams in her own kitchen because he understood in whatever wordless way children understand things that sometimes the thing a person needs is not to be alone in a room. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to tell me," he said, "but I want you to know I'm not scared." "Thomas, I mean it. Whatever's happening, I'm not scared." He looked at her with complete seriousness. "Because you're not going to give up. And if you're not giving up, then I'm not either." She didn't cry. She was very proud of herself for that. "Get to bed," she said. "You've got chores in the morning." He went. She stood at the counter for a long time. Then she went upstairs and knocked on Elias Reed's door. He opened it in seconds like he'd been awake already. She suspected he was often awake already. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need to know if you have any idea what to do about it." He stepped back from the door. She came in and told him everything she'd heard in the alley. Every word. She didn't soften it or editorialize. Just the facts laid out plainly because she had a feeling this was a man who did better with plain. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know the name of the clerk in Helena?" "No." "Dunham will. Is there anyone in this town who knows Dunham's business dealings? Someone who might know which clerk he's used before?" She thought. "Reverend Carey might. He does the account books for the council as a voluntary service. He sees every transaction." "Would he tell you?" "I don't know. He signed the petition." "But he also witnessed your filing papers." Clara looked at him. "You noticed that." "I notice things." He wasn't boasting. It was just a statement. If you can get the clerk's name, Prescott can file a separate verification request directly bypasses the standard processing window. If someone's planning to sit on your paperwork, that at least puts a second copy in a different pile. "That's..." She stopped. "How do you know all of this?" He looked at her. That same long, careful pause. "I spent a lot of years learning how systems work," he said, "specifically how they work against people who don't know they're being used." "Why?" He turned slightly, said nothing for a moment. Then, "Because I needed to understand how it happened to me before I could stop being angry about it." The air between them shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't soft exactly. It wasn't the kind of warmth that comes with comfort. It was something rawer than that, the particular gravity of two people who have both been carrying heavy things alone for a long time and are beginning very cautiously to notice each other's weight. "I'll go see the Reverend in the morning," she said. "I'll find out what I can about Harlan's land assessment. There are ways to..." He stopped. "I have contacts in the surveying office in Billings. If Harlan's already filed a land interest claim on this property, there'll be a record." She stared at him. "Have they?" "I don't know yet." "But you think they might have already?" He met her eyes. "I think men like Harlan don't walk past a property with a measuring tape unless they've already decided to own it," he said. "The only question is whether the paperwork caught up to the intention yet." She didn't sleep at all that night, but she did, for the first time in a month, feel like she wasn't entirely alone in what she was fighting. The next morning, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She came downstairs at first light and found Elias already in the yard, not splitting wood this time, but crouched down in the dirt with Sam and the boy they were now calling Joseph, who had started speaking again 2 weeks ago, after nearly 10 days of complete silence. They were looking at something in the ground. Horse tracks, she realized. Elias was showing them how to read a trail. "See how the left hind is slightly deeper," he was saying, his voice low and patient. "That means the horse was carrying weight unevenly. Could be a sore shoulder. Could be the saddle wasn't fitted right." Joseph looked at the track with enormous concentration. "How do you know it's the left hind?" "Because it's deeper on this side, and because the stride is shorter here." He indicated with one finger. "The horse is compensating." "What do you do?" Sam asked. "When you figure that out, you adjust the load, or you rest the horse. You don't push something through pain just because it's moving." He looked up then and saw Clara in the doorway, and something crossed his face, not embarrassment, but a flicker of self-awareness, as if he'd been caught at something he didn't have a name for yet. She didn't say anything. She went back inside and started the stove. Ruth appeared at her elbow. "Miss Clara, is Mr. Reed going to stay?" "He's paid through next week." "That's not what I asked." Clara looked down at her. 6 years old, and already asking the questions that cut straight to the bone. "I don't know, sweetheart." "I hope he does," Ruth said simply. Then she went to set the table. The morning after that, the fence on the east side of the property, which had been leaning at a dangerous angle since October, and which Clara had been too strapped for time and money to fix, was repaired. New posts, new wire, done quietly overnight without comment. And then the day after that, the youngest children found a set of carved wooden horses on the front step. 3 of them small and smooth and detailed enough that you could see the suggestion of musculature in the haunches, the angle of the neck. No note, no signature. Daniel, who was 4 and spoke in fragments, picked one up and held it against his chest and said very seriously to no one in particular, "Mine." And it was so sudden and so whole, the certainty in that one small word from a child who had owned nothing, that Nora, who was 13 and did not cry, had to leave the room. The town saw the fence. The town saw Elias coming and going. The town put it together in the way towns always put things together, with maximum suspicion and minimum information, and the conclusion they reached was that Clara Whitmore had not only collected orphans and harbored a drifter, but had now allowed that drifter to entrench himself into the property, which meant the situation was no longer a charity case. It was a settlement, an occupation, a provocation. Aldrich called a second council meeting on a Friday afternoon. Clara found out from Reverend Carey, who came to her door with the expression of a man who believes in doing the right thing but wishes it cost less socially. "They're moving forward with the ordinance filing," he said. "They've set a date, 4 weeks from Monday." "That's before my license can clear." "Yes." He paused. "Clara, I want you to know that I voted against setting the date. I'm only one vote." She looked at him carefully. "Reverend, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm asking because lives depend on the answer." He nodded. "Do you know which clerk in the Helena Territorial Office Price Dunham has a relationship with?" The Reverend went very still. "What do you mean by relationship?" "I mean a professional arrangement," she said. "A financial one. The kind that might result in a paperwork delay." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the children moving in the back room, and the sound of Elias somewhere outside, and the distant noise of Main Street going about its business as though nothing was happening here. "His name is Aldous Reeves," the Reverend said finally, very quietly. "He processes Third Territory charity filings. Dunham's been using him for 2 years to slow-walk land clearance documents for properties he has interests in." Clara's jaw tightened. "You knew?" "I suspected." He looked at his hands. "I don't have proof. I only know what I've seen in the account summaries." "I need you to write it down," she said. "Everything you've seen, every entry that looks irregular. I'm not asking you to sign it as accusation. I'm asking you to write it as observation, dated, in your own hand." He was quiet again. "Those children are going to lose their home," she said. "Not because they did anything wrong, because people with money found the land valuable and found the law cooperative, and unless someone who knows what's actually happening is willing to put it on paper, there is nothing I can do to stop it." The Reverend looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened his coat and said, "I'll have it to you by Sunday." She was still standing in the doorway when Elias came around the corner of the house, saw the Reverend leaving, saw her face, and stopped. "What happened?" he said. "I got what I needed," she said. "And I learned what I already suspected, that this has never been about the children at all." Elias studied her. "Harlan's already filed," he said, and his voice was flat and deliberate. "I got the confirmation this morning from my contact in Billings. A conditional land interest claim on this parcel, filed 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Before Aldrich had even come to the door with his 6-week ultimatum. The whole thing had been arranged before she'd ever been given a chance. Clara stood very still. And then something happened to her expression that Elias would think about later. It didn't collapse, didn't harden. It simply settled into something quiet and absolute, and entirely without the trembling edge of fear. "They planned this before they even told me," she said. "Yes. They were never going to let the license clear." "No." She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She looked at the boarding house, the listing porch, the new fence post, the light coming through the kitchen window where she could see Daniel moving around inside holding his carved wooden horse. "Then we're going to need to do something they haven't planned for," she said. Elias waited. She turned and looked at him directly, and there was nothing in her face now but clarity. "I'm going to need your help," she said. "And I'm going to need you to tell me the truth about your past, all of it. Because what I'm thinking of doing is going to put you in front of this town, and you cannot be a question mark when that happens. You need to be something they can't argue with." The wind moved between them. He held her gaze without flinching. "All right," he said. And the look on his face, the look of a man who has spent years carefully avoiding exactly this kind of moment, was not reluctance. It was something that looked a great deal like relief. He told her that night, not at the kitchen table, not in the front room where the children might drift in and out upstairs, in the narrow hallway between their rooms, with the lamp turned low and the wind working at the walls. He stood with his back against the doorframe and his arms crossed over his chest, not because he was defensive, but because it was the only way he knew to hold himself together while he said what he was about to say. He told her he was born in Illinois, that his mother died of fever when he was 4, and his father drank himself through the next 3 years before a creditor came for the house and the furniture and everything in it, including effectively Elias. He told her about the orphanage in Chicago that smelled like lye soap and old wood, and where the man who ran it believed that idleness was a sin, and that 7-year-old boys were not idle if they were moving coal from one end of a basement to the other for 12 hours straight. He told her about the train. "They called it placement," he said. "They put 23 of us on a train in October. Some of us had numbers pinned to our coats like we were parcels. They lined us up on the platform in every town and let the families walk past and look." He stopped. His jaw worked. "The ones nobody picked by the end of the line got redistributed. That's the word they used, redistributed. Elias, I was redistributed twice," he said. "The first family kept me 8 months. The second one kept me 4 years. I wouldn't call either of them families." He looked at her steadily. "I left when I was 14. I don't know if leaving was legal or not, and I didn't particularly care. I worked cattle for 3 years, then spent 2 years doing things I'm not going to detail right now, and then I spent the last decade trying to be someone who didn't owe the world anything and didn't expect anything from it either." Clara was quiet. "That's the truth of it," he said. "All of it." She looked at him for a long moment. "And the things you're not going to detail right now?" "Legal," he said. "Barely in 2 instances, but legal." Would they hold up to scrutiny? If someone looked hard enough and wanted badly enough to find a problem, they might find one case in Texas where the interpretation could go either direction. He paused. "A rancher named Duval. He was running a debt trap operation against a family of homesteaders. I got the family out. Getting them out wasn't pretty." "Is Duval alive?" "Yes." "And the family?" Something shifted in his face. Not pride, it was quieter than that. "They're in Oregon. They sent me a letter 2 years ago. The oldest boy started a school." Clara breathed out slowly. She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not going to use your past to manipulate this town," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to put you in front of people as a prop. I know. What I think is that your truth is the most powerful thing we have. Not because it's dramatic, because it's real. Because when those investors and that council stand in front of this town and call these children a burden, your life is the rebuttal they can't argue with." He was quiet for a long time. "You're asking me to do the one thing I've spent my whole life not doing," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know that. And I'm asking it anyway because I think you're the only person in this county who can make them actually see these children." The wind pushed hard at the wall. He looked past her at nothing for a moment. Then he looked back. "All right," he said again, the same word as before. But this time it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like a door opening. She gave him the plan the next morning over coffee while the children were still asleep. Prescott had confirmed by telegraph that the emergency charter process was viable and that a second filing copy routed through a separate clerk in the Helena office, bypassing Aldous Reeves entirely, was already in motion. Reverend Carey had delivered his written observations late Saturday night, slipping them under the door in an envelope with no name on the outside. 7 pages, in small, precise handwriting, detailing every transaction he'd found irregular in Dunham's council accounts over 2 years. Clara had read all 7 pages twice. "We have the land claim evidence from your Billings contact," she said. "We have the Reverend's documentation of the payment irregularities. We have a second filing copy that Reeves can't touch. What we don't have is time because Aldrich moved the ordinance date up." Elias looked at her. "How far up?" 2 weeks from Monday, not 4. He set down his cup. "He called an emergency council session yesterday afternoon," she said. "The investors are pushing. They want the land cleared before the spring survey. They can't enforce the ordinance before the license decision comes back. They're going to argue that the filing is incomplete. It isn't. Dunham is going to say it is." Clara kept her voice even. "And he has 4 of the 5 council votes. And unless we give the town something to push back against something public and undeniable, the council is going to enforce it, and the territorial board is going to let them, because this is a mining town in Montana, and these are 7 children nobody is officially looking for." The silence between them was heavy and specific. Then the kitchen door banged open, and Thomas came through it still half asleep, followed by Ruth, who was carrying Daniel on her hip, the way she'd started doing without anyone asking her to. And behind them came Nora, who took one look at both of their faces and stopped. "What happened?" Nora said. "Nothing yet," Clara said. "They moved the date," Nora said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at her. "How do you do that? Adults stop finishing their sentences when something's gotten worse." Nora put her hands on her hips. "How much time do we have?" 2 weeks. Nora absorbed this, the way she absorbed most difficult information, with a controlled stillness that made her look 40 years older than she was. Then she nodded once. "Tell me what you need me to do." "You need to go to school and let me handle this." "Miss Clara, with respect, school isn't helping anyone right now. What can I actually do?" Elias spoke for the first time in several minutes. "You can make a list," he said. "Every person in this town who has ever been kind to you. Doesn't have to be big. Doesn't have to be a speech or a donation. Anyone who smiled at you on the street. Anyone who gave you extra at the market. Anyone who ever looked at you like a person instead of a problem." Nora stared at him. "Why?" "Because kindness is a pattern," he said. "And patterns tell you where the door is." She looked at him for a long moment with those assessing eyes. Then she went and got a piece of paper. The next 10 days moved the way time moves when it's running out both too fast and unbearably slow. Clara filed 3 supplementary documents with Prescott's guidance. Elias made 2 trips to Billings that he didn't explain in detail and came back both times with papers she couldn't read, but that Prescott said were exactly what they needed. The Reverend, having committed himself by delivering those 7 pages, seemed to arrive at the conclusion that he was already in the water and might as well swim. He began quietly speaking to other council members' wives at church events, which in Black Hollow was the most efficient distribution system available for any information that needed to move. The children knew something was building. Children always know. Daniel started carrying his wooden horse everywhere and refused to set it down even at dinner. Joseph went quiet again. Not the total silence of before, but the watchful, conserving quiet of a child pulling in everything that might be needed later. Ruth stopped asking questions and started watching doors. Thomas began sleeping with his boots on. On Thursday of the second week, Elias found Thomas sitting on the back step in the dark at 11 o'clock at night. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to him. Thomas spoke first. "Do you think she's going to win?" Elias thought about his answer. "I think she's going to fight harder than anyone in this town has ever fought for anything," he said. "I think she's already done things that should have been impossible. And I think the people trying to take this house are underestimating her in a way they're going to regret." "But do you think she's going to win?" A pause. "I think winning looks different depending on what you're measuring. But the children in this house, you're going to be all right. I believe that. Whatever happens with the building." Thomas was quiet. Then, "I don't care about the building." "I know. I care about her." He looked at his boots. "She's the first person who ever looked at me like I was worth the trouble." Elias was very still for a moment, then quietly, "Yeah," he said. "I know what that costs to find." They sat in the dark together for a while longer, and then Thomas went inside and Elias stayed out there alone for a long time afterward, with something moving across his face that he hadn't let himself feel in so many years he'd almost forgotten what it was called. It was called belonging. And it terrified him more than anything he'd ever ridden into. The Monday before the ordinance date, Gideon Harland came to the boarding house himself. He didn't knock. He opened the front gate and walked to the door with the particular confidence of a man who considers formalities to be other people's concern. And he knocked twice in the brisk, businesslike way of someone who has already decided the conversation will be short. Clara opened the door. Harland was a big man, well-dressed with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years and 40 pounds ago and still carried the memory of it as an entitlement. He looked past her into the house with undisguised assessment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Gideon Harland. I believe you know why I'm here." "I have a good idea," she said. "Would you like to come in, or would you prefer to say what you've come to say from my front step?" He stepped inside. He looked around. He looked at the children's coats on the hooks by the door, at the toys on the shelf at the table set for 9. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not sentiment. The brief, pragmatic calculation of a man cataloging inconvenience. "I'm prepared to offer you a generous settlement," he said. "Enough to relocate yourself and the children comfortably. A fresh start somewhere better suited to," he gestured with one hand, "this kind of arrangement." Clara looked at him. "How much?" He named a figure. It was, she had to admit, a significant amount of money. "And the children," she said. "Where specifically would they go in this comfortable relocation?" "The territorial placement system has excellent, Mr. Harland." She said it quietly, not with heat, with the flat precision of someone who has stopped performing patience. "You're standing in a house where 7 children sleep. You have filed a land claim on this property without disclosing it to the current resident, arranged through a paid clerk to delay a legitimate licensing application, and leveraged 4 members of an elected council with what I believe constitutes either bribery or improper business influence. You've done all of this, and now you are standing here offering me money to go away quietly and hand you these children's home." She paused. "My answer is no." Harland's expression didn't shift much, but something behind it did. "Mrs. Whitmore, I encourage you to consider your position carefully. You are one woman with no legal title, certainty, no verified funding structure, and an ordinance date in 7 days. The outcome of this without cooperation is not pleasant." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, for either of us." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened his coat. "I'll give you 48 hours to reconsider," he said. "You can give me 48 years. The answer will be the same." He left. She shut the door and stood with her back against it and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds. Then she opened them and went to find Elias. He was in the yard with Sam, who had been asking him to explain horse care since Tuesday, and showed no signs of running out of questions. Elias saw her face and stood up. "He came," Elias said. "He made an offer." What kind? The kind that assumes I'm more afraid of poverty than I am of losing. She looked at him. We're out of time to be careful. Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now. I know. He looked at Sam. Go inside. Sam read his tone and went without argument. When he was gone, Elias turned back to Clara. I sent a letter to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena 4 days ago, he said. With copies of everything Harlan's pre-filed land claim Reeves's payment records that your lawyer cross-referenced with Dunham's council accounts, and an affidavit from my contact in Billings attesting to the survey timeline. He paused. I didn't tell you because I wanted to confirm it had been received before I said anything. Clara stared at him. And it was received. 2 days ago. A deputy marshal is on his way. She felt something move through her chest, not relief, yet not quite. More like the first deep breath after a long time underwater. When does he arrive? 5 days, maybe 6. The ordinance is in 7. Yes. The math sat between them. That's tight, she said. It is. If Aldrich moves the date up again, then we make sure he can't move it quietly, Elias said. We make it public, we make it visible, we make it something the whole town is watching so closely that moving it looks exactly like what it is. Clara thought. The Reverend, she said. Sunday service. He'd have to be willing. He gave me 7 pages of evidence, she said. I think he's past willing and into committed. Something crossed Elias's face that was almost a smile. Almost. He caught it before it fully arrived. There's something else, he said. She waited. I want to speak at the service, if Carrie will allow it. He said it straight without drama, but she could hear the cost of it in the flatness of his voice, the deliberate weight of a man choosing to say the thing he'd spent years not saying. Not to perform anything, not to make a speech. I want to tell people what the orphan train system actually does to children. What it did to me. Because right now, they're making a legal argument about property and process, and those 7 children in there are abstract to most of this town. I want to make them concrete. Clara looked at him for a long time. You understand what that means, she said carefully. Once you say it publicly, your history, the Texas situation, all of it, you can't take it back. And Harlan's people will look for any thread they can pull. I know. They'll try to discredit you. They can try. Elias. She said his name with enough weight that he stilled. I need to know you're doing this because you believe it's right. Not because you feel like you owe these children something. Or me something. He met her eyes. I'm doing it, he said slowly. Because I sat on a train platform when I was 9 years old, and nobody in the crowd looked at me like I was a person. And there are 7 children in that house who are about to stand on that same platform, metaphorically speaking, while a town full of people decides whether they're worth the inconvenience. He stopped. I can't fix what happened to me. But I can stand up in that crowd and look at them differently. That's worth whatever it costs. Clara didn't say anything. She turned and went inside, and she did it quickly, because her eyes were doing something she wasn't going to let him see. The Sunday service changed things. Reverend Carey announced from the pulpit that there was a matter of civic importance the congregation needed to hear before the week's ordinance proceedings. He said it in the measured, non-alarmist tone he used for announcements of significant gravity, which meant that half the town had sat up straight before he finished the sentence. He invited Elias Reed to speak. The sound that moved through the pews, the collective shift of 100 people registering that the stranger from the boarding house was now standing at the front of their church, was not silence. It was the specific acoustic of a room full of people who had already made up their minds, discovering that they were about to be asked to unmake them. Elias stood at the front of that room for a moment without speaking. He looked at the faces. Clara watched him look at them, not with hostility, not with performance. Just looking the way a person looks when they're deciding whether a thing can be said in a way that will land true. Then he said, My name is Elias Reed. Most of you have heard some version of my history this past month. I'd like to tell you the actual one. And he did. He told it The way he'd told Clara plainly, without embellishment, without the soft edges that turn experience into story, and story into something you can distance yourself from. He named specific details. The coat with the number on it, the platform in Iowa, the way the second family's oldest son had called him names that a preacher's house on a Sunday morning wasn't going to let him repeat, but that everyone in the room understood without the words. He told them about the Mines children, not as a category, by name. Thomas and Ruth, who walked 1.5 miles through snow, following each other's footprints because they had no one else. Joseph, who spent 10 days without speaking after he arrived because silence was the only thing he had figured out how to own. The twins who had finally 2 nights ago told Clara their names were Henry and William, who flinched every time a door slammed because doors slamming had meant something specific and terrible in whatever house they'd come from last. He told them all of it. And the room went so quiet you could hear the cold outside pressing against the walls. Then a woman in the third pew. Clara didn't know her name well, only that she ran a laundry and had never said a word about the orphan house either. Direction started to cry. Not loudly, just quietly, with her hand pressed over her mouth, looking at the floor. Then a man in the back row, big-shouldered, a blacksmith, by the look of his hand, stood up. "What does she need?" he said. His voice was rough and direct and required absolutely no context. Everyone knew who she was. Clara, sitting to the left near the end of a pew, looked up at him. "Beds," she said. "And a lawyer's fee I can't cover. And 4 more weeks to get the territorial license cleared." "I can build beds," the blacksmith said. A woman 3 rows over. "I have blankets from the church drive last winter. They've been sitting in a box." A farmer in the 5th row, who had been one of the 47 petition signatures, sat with his hands on his knees for a moment. Then he said without looking up, "I can bring milk and eggs, every week, until it's settled." Harlan's man, a thin associate, who had been sitting in the last row making notes in a leather journal, stood up sharply. "This is highly irregular," he said. "The council's proceedings are a legal matter and cannot be." "Sit down, Franklin," said a woman's voice, loud and unambiguous, from the middle of the congregation. Franklin sat down. Margaret Holt, who had been the first person to warn Clara that this was going to go badly, who had signed the petition in the 3rd week, who had looked at those children through the window of her dry goods store for 2 months. With tight lips and folded hands, Margaret Holt stood up from her pew and turned around to face the back of the church. "I want to say something," she said. Her voice was stiff. She was a woman built for conviction, and changing one's conviction publicly was the kind of thing that cost her. It showed. "I want to say that I was wrong, and that I knew somewhere I didn't want to look that I was wrong. And I let my worry about the town's image and my fear about things I don't fully understand outweigh what was plainly obvious to anyone who bothered to actually look at those children." She paused. "I'd like to know how I can help." The silence that followed was a different kind than before. It was the silence of a room mid-turning. Mayor Aldrich sat 3 rows from the front, stiff-backed and expressionless, with the particular blankness of a man working very hard not to show that the ground has shifted under him. Dunham beside him leaned over and whispered something. Aldrich shook him off. Elias had stepped back from the pulpit. He was looking at Clara with an expression she couldn't fully read, not relief, not vindication. Something quieter. The look of a man who came to a town carrying the whole weight of his own history, and is only now standing in this room full of witnesses, beginning to feel it lift. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, because the full force of what he had just done for those 7 children was more than she could hold all at once in a public place. Reverend Carey from the pulpit called for quiet with both hands raised. "The council meeting is Monday morning," he said, when the room had settled. "I'm going to suggest that any member of this congregation who wishes to attend does so, legally and peaceably, as witnesses." He paused. "The ordinance requires public majority support to be enforced under territorial statute. I believe we should let the council know where the public stands." 4 people started talking at once. Harlan's associate, Franklin, left the church fast. Clara already knew where he was going. She caught Elias at the door as the congregation began to move and spoke quietly and close. Harland is going to accelerate. Franklin's going to report everything said here in the last 20 minutes, and Harland's going to go to Aldrich tonight. I know. He might try to move the ordinance to tomorrow, before the marshal arrives. Elias looked at her. Can he? If Aldrich signs off on an emergency session with Dunham and 2 other votes, yes, he can convene it in 12 hours. They looked at each other. Then we need to be ready tonight, Elias said. Clara nodded. She kept her voice absolutely steady. Get the children settled early. I don't want them awake for whatever's coming. They're going to know something's happening. Yes, she said. But knowing and watching are different things. Let me keep the watching part. He nodded once, held her gaze a half-second longer than necessary. Then he went to get the children. At 10:30 that night, while the house was quiet, and 7 children slept with varying degrees of actual rest, a sound came from the road outside horses, several of them moving at a pace that wasn't passing through. Clara was already at the window before it registered. Elias was already at the door. There were 6 men on horseback and 4 more on foot, and at the front of them rode Cal Brewer, with a lantern in one hand and a fold of official papers in the other, and behind him came 2 men Clara didn't recognize, wearing the particular expression of men hired for a specific physical task, who have been told not to ask what the task is called in the morning. Brewer pulled up at the gate. Clara Whitmore, he called out. By order of the Black Hollow Town Council emergency session, convened this evening under Ordinance 12, you are hereby notified that this property is to be vacated. The children are to be remanded to territorial custody, effective immediately. From inside the house through the ceiling, Clara heard the sound of small feet hitting the floor. She heard Ruth's voice, and then Daniel's, and then the low murmur of Nora saying something sharp and quieting. She turned from the window to Elias. He was already looking at her. They moved it, she said. Yes, he said. She squared her shoulders and put her hand on the door. Don't open it yet, he said. Elias, give me 60 seconds. He went to the back of the house. She heard him speak one sentence low and urgent to someone she couldn't see. Then he came back. Open it, he said. She opened the door. Brewer looked at her from across the yard with the expression of a man who is hoping she'll make this uncomplicated. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to step aside. No, she said. Ma'am, these are legal papers. Let me see them. He held them up. She took them from his hand, which required him to ride forward a step, which he did reluctantly. She read them in the lantern light. She read them fully. Every line. These are not signed by a territorial official, she said. This is a municipal council signature only. Under Statute 4 of the Territorial Charter, removal of children from a licensed care arrangement requires a territorial marshal's authorization, not a mayor's. Your license hasn't been. My emergency filing was received and acknowledged 6 days ago. Under territorial processing rules, that acknowledgement constitutes provisional status. She looked up from the papers. You don't have the authority to remove these children tonight. And if you attempt to, you will be doing it in violation of territorial statute in front of witnesses, which means every man who rides through that gate is personally liable. Brewer stared at her. From behind her inside the house, she could hear the children. Nora's voice, steady and deliberate, telling the younger ones something. Ruth saying Clara's name. Daniel not crying, breathing fast, but not crying. And then, from behind Brewer, from the far end of the road, another sound. Horses. Not his men. Something else. A rider came in fast with a lantern, pulling up hard at the edge of the group. It was the blacksmith from the service that morning. Behind him, the farmer from the 5th row. Behind him, 2 more men from the congregation, and the woman from the laundry, and Margaret Holt in her coat and her hat, sitting straight-backed in a wagon, with her arms folded, looking at Cal Brewer like he was an inventory problem she intended to sort. Brewer turned around. He looked at the growing number of people gathering at the edge of his group. His men shifted on their horses. The 2 hired men in the back exchanged a look. Go home, Cal, the blacksmith said, not loudly. It's 10:30 at night, and you're trying to take children out of a warm house by lamplight. Go home." Brewer's jaw tightened. "This is a legal proceeding." "It's an embarrassment," Margaret Holt said from the wagon in the same crisp, final tone she used to refuse bad coin at the register. "And you will not make it worse by pushing it further tonight." The silence stretched. Elias stepped out of the doorway and stood beside Clara. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, solid and still and completely without threat, the way a wall stands. He looked at Brewer with the particular patience of a man who has run out of fear and found something steadier on the other side of it. Brewer looked from Clara to Elias to the crowd behind his own men. He looked at the papers in Clara's hand. He looked at the children's faces pressed against the upstairs window, 7 of them small and luminous in the dark watching. He turned his horse. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Clara said quietly. "It isn't, but tonight it is." And the men rode away in the dark, and the crowd stayed until they were gone, and Elias put his hand briefly on the door frame beside Clara's shoulder, not on her shoulder, just near it close enough to be felt, and neither of them said anything at all. From upstairs, Thomas's voice came through the window, tight with the effort of keeping it controlled. "Miss Clara." She looked up. "Are we okay?" he asked. She held his gaze across the dark yard and the cold air and the distance between a child's terror and an adult's refusal to break. "We're okay," she said. He nodded once with his chin up and his jaw tight in the way of someone who desperately wants to believe something and has decided that deciding to believe it is the same as it being true. Then he disappeared from the window, and Clara stood in the doorway of the house that was still against every calculation hers and felt the night close in around her and knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow would be worse. But tomorrow had not arrived yet, and tonight they were still standing. Tomorrow arrived at 6 in the morning, riding a bay horse and carrying a federal badge. Deputy Marshal James Cord was younger than Clara expected, mid-30s, with a deliberate manner and the kind of eyes that had been trained to look at things without reacting to them first. He introduced himself at the door with his hat already in his hand, which she took as a good sign, and he sat at her kitchen table with the stack of documents she'd prepared and read every page without comment in order while the children drifted in and out the way children do when something important is happening and they're trying to look like they're not paying attention. Elias stood near the back wall and said nothing. He'd done his part. He seemed to understand that this next part wasn't his to carry. Cord finished the last page, squared the stack, and set it flat on the table. "The land claim filing is the problem," he said. "Everything else, the clerk, the council votes, the ordinance manipulation. Those are county-level issues, and honestly, the territorial board will sort them in 6 weeks regardless. But a pre-filed land interest claim against an occupied property with a pending shelter license is a federal matter. That's not something Mayor Aldrich can proceed against." "He tried last night," Clara said. Cord looked at her. "Tried and failed from what I understand." "By a narrow margin." "Narrow is fine, it still counts." He closed the folder. "I'm going to need to speak with Aldrich this morning, and with Harland directly. I'd recommend you stay here with the children and let me handle the official conversation." "I've been handling the official conversation for 3 weeks, she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." He said it without condescension. "You've been handling it extraordinarily well, which is why there's something to hand off. Let me carry it from here." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He left. She turned around and found all 7 children staring at her from various points around the kitchen with the collective held breath expression of people waiting for a verdict. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "Is it over?" Ruth asked. "Not yet." "Is it going to be over soon?" Clara looked at her 6 years old, still in her nightgown, clutching the edge of the table with both hands. "Yes," she said. "Soon." It was the truest thing she could say without knowing whether it was completely true. Thomas, who had been watching her face, instead of listening to the words, stood up from his chair, walked across the kitchen and put his arms around her waist. He didn't say anything. He just held on. After a moment, Ruth came and attached herself to Clara's left side. Then Daniel appeared from under the table, which was where he went when the world felt too large, and pressed himself against her leg with his wooden horse clutched to his chest. Clara stood there, with 3 children holding on to her, and felt the full, crushing, overwhelming weight of what she was fighting for land in her chest all at once. Nora from the doorway watched all of it with her arms folded and her eyes very bright. "Eat your breakfast," she said in a near-perfect imitation of Clara's exact tone. Clara laughed. It surprised everyone in the room, including herself, a short, genuine, undignified sound that she hadn't expected that broke something loose in the air of the kitchen and made even Daniel look up with his enormous eyes. Then Thomas laughed too. Then Ruth. And then from the doorway, Nora allowed herself a smile of approximately 40% full capacity, which from her was practically a standing ovation. They ate breakfast. Cord was at the town hall for 3 hours. Clara knew because she counted. She wasn't at the window the whole time she had chores, and the children had lessons she was trying to maintain as a semblance of normalcy. And Elias spent the morning rebuilding the section of the front porch railing that someone had kicked loose the week before, without commenting on how it got that way. But every 30 minutes or so, she found herself near the front of the house listening for sounds from the direction of Main Street. Nora found her doing it the 3rd time. "Stop," she said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're listening through walls. It's not going to make him come back faster." Clara turned away from the window. "Since when did you become the sensible one?" "I've always been the sensible one," Nora said. "You just kept thinking I was a child." "You are a child." "I'm 13. In 1881, that's negotiable." Clara looked at her for a long moment. This girl who had been moved 3 times, who wore her wariness like armor, who had spent 2 months watching Clara fight for them and had responded by becoming quietly, and without announcement, the most reliable person in the house. "You know," Clara said carefully, "whatever happens next, whatever the marshal sorts out today, I want you to know that I have never once considered you a burden." Nora's expression didn't change. "Nora, I heard you, and—" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It still scares me," she said. "When someone says something like that, it scares me every time because every time before the next thing that happened proved it wasn't true." Clara held her gaze. "I know, and I'm not going to promise you that nothing hard will happen. But I'm going to promise you that however hard it gets, I'm not going to decide you were more trouble than you're worth. That's not a promise I'm making, because it's easy. It's a promise I'm making because these last 2 months have been the hardest of my adult life, and I have not once, not for one single morning, wished you weren't here." Nora looked at her for a long time. Her jaw moved slightly. "Okay," she said. The same word Thomas used, the same weight in it. She went back to the kitchen. Clara stood at the window and did not cry, which was becoming a practiced skill she was developing at a remarkable rate. Cord came back at noon. He sat at the table again and put his hat down and said, "Harland is withdrawing the land interest claim." Clara sat down slowly. "Why?" "Because I explained to him in detail what a federal investigation into an improperly filed pre-acquisition claim against an occupied charitable property would cost him. Not in fines. In time. And in the Continental Western Railway's opinion of a business partner who generates federal investigations." He paused. "Harland is a businessman. The math was simple. And Dunham is going to have a conversation with the territorial board about his relationship with Aldous Reeves. That conversation will not be comfortable for him. He is aware of this. And Aldrich." Cord was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich is a more complicated situation. He's not corrupt the way Dunham is corrupt. He's the kind of man who got in over his head with powerful people and convinced himself it was leadership." He looked at her steadily. "He's going to call a public council session tomorrow morning to formally suspend the ordinance proceedings." Clara absorbed this. "He's not going to admit what he did." "No. He's going to call it a re-evaluation based on new information. That's not accountability." "No," Cord agreed. "It isn't. But it means the children stay." He held her gaze. That's what we came for, Mrs. Whitmore. She sat with that for a moment. The children stayed. The land was safe. The license would clear in its own time, and in the meantime, the provisional status held. It was not the clean justice of a story where every wrong thing got named, and every person responsible stood up and said so. It was the messier, more ordinary justice of systems, grinding to a halt when someone stands in front of them and refuses to move. Your filing, Cord said, will be approved within 30 days. I'm recommending expedited processing to the Territorial Board. He stood. You built something here, Mrs. Whitmore. It took longer than it should have to get the right people to see it. But they see it now. He left. Clara sat at the table alone. From outside, she heard Elias's hammer against the porch railing. From the back room, the sound of Thomas reading aloud he'd taken to reading to Daniel and Ruth in the afternoons, not because anyone asked him to, but because he'd noticed it settled them. From the kitchen, the quiet sounds of Nora doing the lunch dishes without being told. This was it. This was what she'd been fighting to protect. Not a building, not a property line. This specific sound of this specific house full of people who had chosen each other. She put her head in her hands and finally privately let herself feel all of it at once. She didn't hear Elias come in. She only knew he was there because the hammer stopped. She straightened up fast and turned toward the window away from him, because she was not going to perform falling apart in front of him on top of everything else. It's settled, he said. He's withdrawing the claim. Council's suspending the ordinance. Elias was quiet. It's not everything, she said. Dunham gets a conversation, not a consequence. Aldrich gets to call it a reevaluation. Her voice was steady. Mostly. But the children stay. Yes, he said. Spring came to Black Hollow the way it always does in Montana, without ceremony, without warning one morning. The cold just loosened its grip by a single degree, and the world exhaled. Clara noticed it first in the children. Something in them had been held tight all winter. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular tension of people who have learned not to fully relax until the danger has passed long enough to be believed. When the snow started pulling back from the yard, and the mud came up soft and dark under the new fence posts, that tension began slowly, incrementally to release. Ruth started singing while she set the table. Daniel started leaving his wooden horse somewhere other than directly against his body. The twins Henry and William began finishing each other's sentences in the way of people who have decided a place is permanent enough to develop shared language in. Thomas was the last to let go. Clara noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she came into the back room and found him not watching the door, not positioned near the window, not doing any of the small vigilant things he'd been doing since October. He was just sitting on the floor with a book open across his knees and his back against the wall, and his face entirely unguarded, reading the way a child reads when he feels completely safe. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked up. What? Nothing, she said. Just looking. He gave her the expression children give adults when adults are being inexplicable and went back to his book. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and allowed herself for the first time in 6 months to believe that this was actually going to hold. The territorial license arrived in full confirmation on the 14th of March, a thick envelope from Helena with an embossed seal and 3 signatures and a formal certificate that Prescott had framed without being asked and delivered to the door with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who has done something he's genuinely glad he did. Clara hung it on the wall in the front room, and Ruth stood in front of it with her arms folded, reading it carefully. She turned to Clara. Does this mean they can't take us away? It means this house is officially a licensed children's shelter under territorial law, Clara said. Which means any attempt to remove you requires a territorial marshal's authorization and a full legal process. Which means yes, they cannot simply take you away. Ruth looked at the certificate for another long moment. It should say that, she said. The part about they can't take us away. It should say that right at the top, so it's the first thing people read. I'll take that up with the Territorial Board, Clara said. You should. Ruth walked away with the decisive confidence of someone who has registered a complaint and expects it to be addressed. Behind her, Nora stood in the hallway with her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes doing something she would have denied categorically if asked. Elias's construction on the addition finished in the third week of March, 2 days before Ruth's birthday. He'd been working on it since January, early mornings, evenings after the children were settled, full Saturdays, when Clara took the children to church, and he stayed behind with his tools and the specific, focused quiet of a man who builds things the way other people pray. The result was 2 new rooms on the east side, solid and square, and correctly insulated with windows that opened cleanly and floors that didn't slope. He came into the kitchen the morning it was done and said, "It's finished." Clara looked up from the stove. "I know. I could tell by the silence." He almost smiled. "I'd like you to see it." She followed him to the addition. He opened the door and stepped back so she could go in first, which she understood as the specific gesture. It was not deference, but offering. She stood in the first room. The morning light came through the window at the right angle. The walls were straight. It smelled like new wood and cold air, and the particular cleanness of something built with care. "It's good work," she said. "It'll hold," he said. "However many children come." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, his hat in his hands, and the look on his face was the same one she'd seen on the roof in January, that open, unguarded look that still cost him something every time he let it show. "I have a proposal," he said. She waited. "Not that kind," he said quickly. Then, with the smallest possible edge of something that might have been embarrassment, "Not yet." She kept her face neutral with a significant effort. "I'd like to build a ranch," he said. "On the east parcel, the land adjacent that Harlan's people abandoned when they withdrew the claim. It came up for public land filing last week. I put in the application." He looked at his hat. "The idea being that when the children age out, when they're 16, 17, old enough that the shelter license no longer covers them, they have somewhere to go. Work, housing, wages, something of their own to build toward." Clara looked at him. "I have the savings," he said. "It's what I've been carrying for years without knowing what it was for." He looked up. "I know now." "Elias," she said, "you're proposing to build an entire working ranch to give these children a future." "Yes." "That's going to take years." "I'm aware. You'll need to be here for years." He met her eyes. "Clara, I promised Ruth I'd be here in March. I'm here." A pause. "I intend to keep being here." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Then you'd better put in a bigger kitchen," she said, "because the way these children eat whatever you build is going to need a serious pantry." He did smile then, finally the real version, and it changed his entire face. It was the face of a man who had lived for 30 years behind a careful exterior and had just completely let someone through. "I'll account for the pantry," he said. It was Ruth's birthday that cracked Black Hollow open the rest of the way. Clara hadn't planned it as an event. She'd planned a cake, some small gifts, a quiet afternoon with the household. But Margaret Holt arrived in the morning with a ribbon-wrapped package, and the farmer from the 5th row sent his wife with a jar of honey and 2 pounds of butter, and the blacksmith came by himself with a small carved music box that he'd made. He said gruffly, because his daughter had one, and he thought every girl ought to have one, and he did not make eye contact with anyone while he said it. By afternoon there were 14 people in the boarding house, and it had become, without formal announcement, a celebration. Ruth moved through it with the specific bewilderment of a 6-year-old who has been given more than she knew how to hold. At one point Clara found her standing alone in the kitchen doorway, very still, watching the room full of people who had come for her. "Are you all right?" Clara asked. Ruth turned. Her eyes were full. "People came," she said. "They did. People came for me." Clara crouched down. "Yes, sweetheart. They did." Ruth pressed her lips together the way children do when they're working very hard not to cry and know that crying will mean everyone can see how much something mattered. "Nobody ever did that before," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Is this what it's like having people?" Clara looked at her, this 6-year-old girl, who had followed her brother's footprints through a 1.5 miles of snow, who had been hauled from place to place and taught by repetition and indifference to expect very little. Standing in a house full of people who had come on a Tuesday afternoon in March because it was her birthday and she existed, and that was reason enough. "Yes," Clara said. "This is exactly what it's like." Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and went back into the room and was caught immediately by the blacksmith's wife, who had apparently decided to take Ruth's ribbon situation in hand, and Ruth submitted to this with the particular helpless dignity of someone being fussed over and not entirely minding. The twist nobody saw coming arrived in the first week of April. A letter came for Elias. He read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while the children were at their lessons in the front room. Clara had converted the sitting room into a proper classroom in February, with a chalkboard Elias had built and mounted, and a row of small desks that the blacksmith had constructed from the plans Nora had sketched somewhat imperiously with exact measurements. Clara watched Elias read the letter. She watched his face go through 3 distinct changes: stillness, then something complicated, then a careful blankness that meant he was deciding something. "What is it?" she said. He set the letter down flat on the table, which was how he handled things he wanted to be honest about rather than manage. "It's from a man named Caleb Ward. He was on the orphan train with me. He's in Colorado now, running a small cattle operation." He paused. "He's dying. He has a son 8 years old. Wife passed 2 years ago. He has no one else to leave the boy to." Clara sat down. "He heard about Black Hollow somehow," Elias said. "About the shelter. About—" He stopped. "About me being here." "What does he want?" Elias looked at the letter. "He's asking if his son can come here. When the time comes." He looked up. "He doesn't want the boy on a train." The silence between them held everything neither of them needed to say. "Write back today," Clara said. "Tell him yes." Elias looked at her. "Tell him the boy has a place here," she said. "Tell him he can come now if he'd rather not wait. Tell him—" She paused. "Tell him his son will not be redistributed." Elias held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. "All right," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm trying to figure out," he said slowly, "how a person is supposed to feel when the thing they survive turns into the thing they can actually do something about." Clara looked at him. "I think," she said, "it feels like this." He nodded once, and then he got up and went to find paper and a pen, and he wrote the letter, and he sent it that afternoon. The boy arrived 6 weeks later. His name was Peter. He was 8 years old, dark-haired and quiet with a quality of stillness that Clara recognized immediately from Thomas's first week. The stillness of a child deciding whether trust was structurally sound enough to put any weight on. He stood in the front room with a bag that held everything he owned and looked at the room full of children watching him, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Thomas stood up. He crossed the room, put out his hand and said, "I'm Thomas. I got here in October. That's Ruth, she'll ask you too many questions. Those two are Henry and William. They finish each other's sentences, you get used to it. That's Nora, she's in charge of everything whether we ask her to be or not." Nora from across the room did not deny this. "Daniel's under the table," Thomas continued. "He does that. You can join him if you want. He doesn't mind company." Peter looked at the table. Then he looked at Thomas. "Is it good here?" he said. Very simply. The most direct question a child can ask. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "It's good here." Peter set his bag down. Summer arrived, and the ranch framework went up on the east parcel posts and beams that Elias worked on with Sam and Joseph, who were 13 and 12 now, and had opinions about everything, and the particular fierce energy of boys who have been told they matter and are still slightly astonished by it. Thomas helped on the weekends. Even Henry and William, who tended to approach most things with an air of ironic detachment, showed up on Saturdays with tools and worked with an efficiency that suggested they'd been wanting an excuse to do exactly this for months. Margaret Holt, who had expanded her 3 afternoons a week to also include practical accounting sessions with Thomas and a running argument with Nora about the best structure for a business ledger, came by the site one Saturday afternoon and stood with her arms folded, watching the frame go up. "I owe you an apology," she said to Clara standing beside her. "A proper one, not the public version I gave at the church. Margaret, let me say it." She kept her eyes on the construction. "I knew those children weren't dangerous. I knew it the first week. I signed that petition because Dunham told me it would affect property values, and I let my ledger book do my conscience's job." She paused. "I was wrong, and I was cowardly. And I would like you to know that I know both of those things." Clara looked at her. Margaret Holt was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who said things that cost her easily. This had cost her. "I know," Clara said, "and I'd like you to know that what you've done for Nora this spring, that's not nothing. That's not close to nothing." Margaret was quiet. "She's going to be extraordinary," she said, not warmly matter-of-factly in the tone of someone making an accurate assessment. "She's going to need someone to teach her how to fight with documentation instead of fury." "Are you volunteering?" "I've been volunteering since February. I'm simply clarifying the long-term commitment." She unfolded her arms. "I'll see you Thursday." She walked back toward Main Street. Clara watched her go and thought about what it looks like when a person chooses to become better than they've been, not all at once, not with announcement, but through the slow, unglamorous work of showing up differently. Mayor Aldrich came to the boarding house on a Monday afternoon in August. He came alone. No deputy, no council member, no official document in hand. He knocked. Clara answered. He stood on the porch with his hat in both hands and the look of a man who has been rehearsing something and has just realized no rehearsal was actually adequate. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in the front room, the classroom now with the chalkboard and the small desks and the children's work tacked to the walls in Nora's organized arrangement, and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "I owe you an accounting," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "You do." He breathed out slowly. "I told myself it was leadership, managing competing interests, making the pragmatic decision." He looked at his hat. "The truth is, I let Harlan talk me into believing that what was convenient for his railroad was what was right for this town, and I let that belief override what I could see plainly in front of me." He looked up. "Those are children. They were always just children, and I treated them like a problem to be managed." Clara held his gaze and said nothing. She had learned this past year that there are moments when silence is the most useful thing when the person speaking needs the space to finish without rescue. "I'm not asking for absolution," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to do something useful instead. The free school you're planning, I'd like to put the town's formal support behind it. Funding, a legal charter, whatever it takes to make it official territory-wide." He paused. "Not to redeem myself, because it's the right thing to do, and someone should have done it a long time ago." Clara looked at him for a long time. "The school needs a building," she said, "separate from the shelter, large enough for 40 children. I can get the council to approve the funds. And a teacher's salary, not charity wages." "Agreed. And the children from this house attend free, all of them. No means testing, no character assessment, no discussion of their history or their parents or where they came from." "Agreed," he said without hesitation this time. She looked at him. Aldrich was not a transformed man. She wasn't naive enough to believe one conversation accomplished that. He was a man who had done a wrong thing and was trying inadequately and sincerely at the same time to do something righter. She understood the difference between transformation and correction. She respected the correction for what it was. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Bring the council charter paperwork. And bring Prescott if he's in town. I want a lawyer in the room." Aldrich nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked to the door and paused. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "for what it's worth, this town is better for what you refuse to let us do." She didn't answer that. She just closed the door after him and stood for a moment in the room with the chalkboard and the small desks and the children's work on the walls. Then she went and found Elias. He was at the ranch site, Just him late afternoon checking the beam alignment on the north wall with the quiet, methodical attention he brought to every physical thing he built. He heard her coming and looked up. She told him about Aldrich. He listened. His face went through the thing it did when he was processing, not reacting, just receiving, making room. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "A school," he said. "Official, chartered, free." He looked at the beam he'd been checking. "What are you going to call it?" She hadn't thought about that yet. She thought about it now. "I don't know," she said. "Something that says what it is, what it's for." "What is it for?" "Children who need somewhere to go," she said. "Children who need someone to look at them and not see a burden." He looked at her. "Call it that then." "I can't call a school not a burden." The corner of his mouth moved. "Call it something that means the same thing." He paused. "What's the thing you said to Thomas in the kitchen that morning when he asked if they should leave?" She thought back. "I told him the reason they wanted him gone had nothing to do with who he was. And that he didn't have to carry their choice, that it wasn't his to carry." Elias nodded slowly. "Call it Whitmore Free School," he said, "and let that be what it means." She looked at him. "Your name?" he said simply. "On something that'll stand after both of us are gone. That's what it's for." She held his gaze for a long moment. The light was going amber, and the air was warm, and from the direction of the house, she could hear the children. Ruth's voice rising above the others. The specific pitch of Daniel's laugh when something surprised him, Thomas calling someone's name. "I have something to say to you," she said. "All right. I have been watching you for 8 months, she said. "Build things, quietly, without being asked and without requiring credit. I've watched you sit on a porch step with a boy at 11 o'clock at night. I've watched you teach children to read tracts in the dirt like it was the most important curriculum anyone could offer. I've watched you stand in a church full of people who had already decided who you were and tell them the truth about yourself anyway." She stopped. "I have watched you choose over and over to stay." He was very still. "I'm in love with you," she said. Plainly, without the softening edge of implication. "I have been for a while. I wanted to say it directly because you are a man who does better with direct things." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on his face. Not the guarded warmth she'd come to know, not the quiet steadiness, not the careful distance. Something fully open. Something that had no name yet, because it was still in the process of becoming. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to say it back right now." "I love you," he said. "I've been trying to figure out the right time to say it since February, and I kept deciding the moment wasn't right, and then I'd go fix something instead." She laughed. She couldn't help it. "How many things did you fix instead of saying it?" "The porch. Both windows on the east side. The barn door twice. Most of the roof." "The roof needed fixing." "Some of the roof needed fixing," he said. "I may have been thorough." She laughed again, and he looked at her, laughing with an expression of such complete and undefended tenderness that she stopped, and they stood there in the warm August light, looking at each other with the full weight of everything they'd built and survived and chosen and kept choosing, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things don't need more words. He took her hand. She held on. The grand opening of Whitmore Free School happened on the first Saturday of October 1 year and 3 weeks after Thomas had sat on the front steps with a burlap sack and no coat, and Clara had brought him inside. The whole town came, not because they were required to, not because a council vote had determined that attendance was in the town's best interest, because somewhere between that Sunday in March, when Elias stood at the front of the church and spoke the truth, and the summer of small gestures, and barn raisings, and birthday parties, and Margaret Holt fighting with Nora over ledgers, Black Hollow had made a decision. Not all at once, not cleanly, but the way real changes happen gradually through accumulated contact with something that kept refusing to be ignored. The school building stood solid and white, with a bell that Thomas had painted himself, and that Ruth had officially designated as her bell to ring on the first morning, and that nobody had argued with. The sign above the door read, "Whitmore Free School, all children welcome." There was a ceremony. Aldrich spoke briefly, and to his credit, said what he'd said in Clara's front room, that the town owed these children something that couldn't be fully repaid, but that this school was the beginning of an attempt. He did not make it comfortable for himself. Clara noted that and gave him the credit it was worth. Reverend Carey gave a blessing and meant every word of it. The blacksmith's wife started crying before anyone had said anything significant and continued intermittently for the duration which set a tone that the rest of the crowd seemed to find both appropriate and permissive. And then Annie spoke. She was the youngest of the children who had arrived during the blizzard 4 years old when she came nearly 6. Now small and serious, with the kind of enormous eyes that saw everything and stored it all. She had not been a talker. She was precise with her words in the way of a person who knows that words are not free and chooses which ones to spend. She walked to the front of the gathered crowd holding Elias's hand. He hadn't known she was going to do it. Clara watched his face when Annie took his hand and pulled him forward, the startlement of it, the way he looked down at her, the way she didn't look back, but simply held on and walked, expecting him to come, which he did. She stood in front of the crowd. She looked at all the faces. She took her time. Then she said in a voice that was small but carried, "People said nobody wanted us." The crowd went completely still. She looked at Clara, then at Elias. "They were wrong," she said. 3 words. The most precise thing anyone had said all morning. In the silence that followed, the blacksmith in the 4th row made a sound that he would later describe as clearing his throat. The woman from the laundry pressed both hands over her face. Margaret Holt, standing to the left with her arms folded in their customary position, looked at the school sign above the door with her jaw set and her eyes very bright. Thomas, standing beside Clara, reached over without looking and took her hand. She held it. Elias looked across the crowd at her. His expression was the open one, the one that had no guard on it, the one that it had taken him 30 years of hard road to be able to wear in public, the one that said everything he'd said in August, and everything that came before it, and everything that would come after. She looked back at him and felt the full weight of the year, every rock through the window, every night counting inches of firewood, every moment of calculated, unperformed refusal. The marshal's envelope, and the deed with her name on it, and the sound of 7 children, discovering they were allowed to take up space. The roof in January, and the hand in August, and the man who had ridden into Black Hollow on a gray horse, and quietly, methodically built a future out of everything the world had tried to throw away. It had cost her everything she had. It had given her everything that mattered. Nora leaned close to Clara's ear. "For what it's worth," she said quietly. "I knew from the first week you weren't going to give up." "Did you?" Clara said. "You chopped wood with bleeding hands at midnight," Nora said. "People who are going to give up don't do that." Clara looked at her, this girl who had been moved 3 times and wore her wariness like armor, and had slowly through the course of one impossible winter allowed herself to put it down. Who was going to be extraordinary? Who already was? "Neither do you," Clara said. Nora looked away. Her jaw moved. "Shut up," she said with approximately 40% of the heat she intended. "I'm trying to watch the ceremony." Clara smiled. Around her Black Hollow stood in the October sun and looked at a school that hadn't existed a year ago, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to decide that 7 children were someone else's problem. The bell above the door caught the light. Inside 40 desks waited. The sign said what it meant. What the sign did not say, what didn't need to be written anywhere, because it was true and visible and woven into every plank and post and promise of the place, was this: sometimes the people the world is most determined to throw away turn out to be the ones who teach everyone else what it actually means to stay. And in Black Hollow, Montana, in the autumn of 1882, 7 children who had been called burdens built something that outlasted everyone who had called them that. They built it out of one woman's courage, one man's long-carried truth, and the kind of stubborn, ordinary daily love that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, every single morning, and refuses to leave. So, she turned around. Her eyes were probably red. She didn't particularly care. Yes. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who wants to say something and is working out whether saying it will cost more than it's worth. What? She said. Nothing. Elias. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. I'm glad, he said. That's all. I'm just glad. It was such a simple thing to say. Such an insufficient, ordinary, completely genuine thing to say. And it landed in her chest with more weight than anything complicated could have. So am I, she said. The town took 3 days to fully process what had happened. On the first day, people came to the boarding house with things: the blacksmith's beds, the church blankets, a basket of eggs from the farmer in the 5th row. They came to the door and handed things over without much ceremony, which was the right way to do it. Clara thanked each person without making them feel the full weight of what their coming meant, because she understood that some people are only able to do the right thing if they aren't required to also acknowledge having done the wrong one first. Margaret Holt came on the second day on her own without anything in her hands. Clara answered the door and waited. I'd like to help with the children, Margaret said. Her voice had the precise, controlled quality of a woman doing something difficult and determined not to advertise how difficult it is. Specifically, I'd like to help the girl, Nora. She's intelligent. If someone were to spend time with her on arithmetic and practical business, she has a mind that could go somewhere if it had somewhere to go. Clara looked at her for a long moment. She'd probably argue with you, she said. I'd probably argue back, Margaret said. I believe that's called education. Clara stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Nora from the kitchen called out. Who is it? Someone who wants to fight with you about arithmetic, Clara called back. A pause. Then with audible suspicion, fine. On the third day, something shifted in Elias. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things about him peripherally at first, then, with increasing clarity, as the picture assembled itself. He was still there. Still doing the things he did. The fence, the wood, the quiet, steady presence in the yard that the children had stopped questioning and started depending on. But there was a difference in how he moved through the house. Less like someone passing through. More like someone who'd stopped calculating the distance to the door. Thomas noticed it too. Mr. Eli isn't leaving, he said at breakfast very casually, as though he was noting weather. Mr. Reed is a boarder, Clara said. He's paid up. He fixed the barn foundation yesterday. That's not something you do if you're leaving. Clara looked at her coffee. Just saying, Thomas said, and went back to his biscuit with the satisfied expression of someone who has said exactly what he meant. That afternoon, Elias asked her if she'd walk with him to look at the east side of the property. He had an idea, he said, about the back structure, the old tool shed, that had been leaning at a dangerous angle since before she'd owned the place. She walked with him. He told her his idea. It wasn't a shed repair. It was a plan, a full structural rebuild using the shed footprint as a foundation for a proper addition. 2 more rooms. Enough for 6 more children if the need arose, which both of them understood it would, because the need didn't stop when one house solved it. That's a significant project, she said. I have time. You have paid accommodation through next week. He looked at her sideways. I could pay further ahead. She looked at the shed, at the property, at the line of fence posts he'd put in straight and solid a month ago, at the barn doors that no longer hung crooked, at the porch railing he'd finished that morning. You've been rebuilding this place since the week you arrived, she said. It needed rebuilding. Elias. She said it the way she always said it when she needed him to stop deflecting. Why are you still here? He was quiet for a moment. I told you, he said, in the hallway that night, about the platform, about nobody looking. I remember, when I rode into this town, I wasn't looking for anything. I was doing what I do, which is moving through places without staying long enough to matter." He paused. "And then I saw you chopping wood with your hands bleeding, and inside the house I could hear children, and something in me just—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been places that needed things. I've fixed things before and moved on. That's not what this was." "What was it?" she said carefully. He turned and looked at her directly. "It felt like somewhere I was supposed to have arrived a long time ago," he said. "And I didn't know what to do with that, so I fixed the fence." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she turned toward the shed and said, "Show me the plan for the addition." He showed her. He'd been thinking about it longer than just that afternoon. She could tell from the specificity of it, the way he'd already worked out the angles, the timber count, the way the new structure would need to brace against the existing east wall. He talked about it with his hands in the particular animated way he talked when he'd been thinking about something carefully and was finally letting it out. And Clara watched him and thought about what Thomas had said at breakfast, and about the barn foundation, and about all the quiet, unremarked-on things a man does when he stops calculating the distance to the door. She thought about what it costs to stop calculating that distance when every place you've ever loved has eventually thrown you out. "I'd like you to stay," she said. He stopped talking. "Not because the property needs work," she said. "Not because the children need someone to teach them to read horse tracks. Because I would like you to stay." The pause between them was very specific. She felt the full weight of it, what she was saying, what she wasn't quite saying yet, what the territory between the two of them had been slowly becoming for 2 months, and had not been named. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it's complicated." "It's not complicated," he said. "It's the opposite of complicated. That's what scares me." She looked at him. "You're telling me you're afraid of something simple. I'm telling you I'm afraid of something I actually want," he said. "Which is different from being afraid of hard things. Hard things I'm good at. Wanting something and trusting that it'll still be there tomorrow." He stopped. "That's the thing that's gotten taken from me more than once." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to trust that nothing hard will happen." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to trust that I'm not going to decide you're more trouble than you're worth." He stared at her. "You said that to Nora." "I meant it both times." Something happened to his face, slow like ice thawing, like a door that hasn't been opened in years, finally giving way on its hinges. Not a smile exactly, but the territory a smile comes from, the real foundation of one. "I'll draw up the building plan tonight," he said. "I'll make coffee," she said. They walked back to the house together. What followed was not a transformation. Transformations are dramatic, clean, complete. What followed was more like a slow return of warmth to something that had been cold for a long time. Gradual, incremental, full of small moments that added up to something large. The blacksmith's beds arrived on a Thursday, and Elias and Sam spent the afternoon assembling them, while Thomas handed over bolts with the serious efficiency of someone who has been given a real job and intends to do it correctly. Henry and William, who had given their names but were still in the process of giving much else, helped move furniture without being asked, and seemed to find the act of rearranging a space together quietly satisfying in a way nobody commented on, because commenting would have made it fragile. Margaret Holt came 3 afternoons a week and sat with Nora at the kitchen table over sums and ledgers, and their dynamic was as predicted, contentious and productive in equal measure. Nora corrected Margaret twice in the first week. Margaret corrected Nora 4 times. By the 3rd week, they were correcting each other simultaneously, and neither of them was looking up from the page to notice that they'd stopped being adversarial and started being something else entirely. Ruth, who had been watching Elias for 2 months with the focused assessment of someone making a very important decision, walked up to him one morning while he was working on the addition framework and said, "Are you going to be here for my birthday?" He looked down at her. "When is it?" "March." "That's 2 months away." "I know. Are you going to be here?" He set down his tool, crouched down so they were at eye level. "I'm going to be here in March," he said. She evaluated this. "Do you promise?" Something moved across his face. The particular seriousness of a man who understands what it costs a child to ask for a promise and what it costs to break one. "I promise," he said. She nodded once, satisfied, went inside. He stayed crouched for a moment longer. Then he picked up his tool and went back to work, and Clara, who had been standing just inside the back doorway and heard all of it, went back to the stove before he could look up and see her watching. The twist came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the ordinance was suspended. Prescott arrived at the door with 2 documents. The first was the territorial license confirmation 30 days on the dot, exactly as Cord had promised. Clara read it twice and then put it flat on the table and pressed both palms against it. Official. Certified. Hers. The second document was something she hadn't expected and hadn't asked for. It was a deed amendment. The original property deed registered under her late husband Robert's name had been quietly corrected through a territorial administrative process to list her name as the primary holder. Sole holder. She looked at Prescott. "Who did this?" Prescott cleaned his glasses. "My instructions were to deliver the documents." "The same donor. The documents are real and fully registered, Mrs. Whitmore. That's what matters." She looked at Elias, who was sitting across the table, and whose expression told her absolutely nothing. "Elias, the deed should have been in your name from the start," he said. "Your husband's estate had a technical error in the original filing. It just needed someone to submit the correction." "That's not a correction you file casually." "No," he agreed. "It takes someone who knows which office handles estate title corrections and which clerk doesn't owe Price Dunham a favor." She stared at him. He looked back at her without expression. "You've been doing things," she said, quietly in the background the whole time. "The Helena lawyer, the Billings contact, the deed." "The fence needed fixing," he said. "Elias, Clara." He leaned forward slightly, and for once he dropped the careful distance in his voice and let her hear what was underneath it. Not sentiment, not performance. Just the plain truth of a man saying what he means. "I spent 30 years watching the law be used against people who didn't know it well enough to fight back. I know how to use it the other way. I wanted to use it for something that actually mattered." He held her gaze. This mattered. Prescott, with the professional tact of a man who has learned when to pack his briefcase, was already at the door. Clara sat with the deed in her hands, her name, in clean, registered official print. Not a widow holding on to her dead husband's property. A woman who owned her own land, her own house, her own future. She understood in that moment exactly what Elias Reed was. Not a drifter. Not a man passing through. A man who had spent his whole life learning how the machinery of the world worked so that he could one day turn it in the right direction. A man who had ridden into Black Hollow with nothing but a saddlebag and a gray horse, and had methodically, quietly, without ever asking for credit, built a fortress around 7 children and 1 woman who hadn't known the walls were going up until they were already standing. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one that was the real foundation of a smile, the warmth beneath the surface of a man who'd kept his surface guarded for so long, he'd almost forgotten what was under it. "Help me fix the roof this evening," she said. "The east side is leaking again." His mouth curved. "All right." They went up after supper, while the light was still good, and worked side by side on the east slope with the tools and the specific focused quiet of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms. The children's voices rose and fell below them. The sky went from blue to gold, to the particular deep amber of a Montana evening in winter, and the cold came in clean and sharp, the way it does when a storm has passed and left the air entirely clear. They worked, and then, after a long stretch of comfortable quiet, Elias set down his hammer and looked at the town laid out below them. Main Street, the church steeple, the railroad survey stakes at the far edge of the property line that Harlan's people had abandoned when the claim was withdrawn, the small figures of people going about their ordinary lives. "You saved those children," he said, not loudly, like something he'd been thinking about for a while that had finally found its way to the surface. All of this, the marshal, the license, the deed, none of it would have moved without you standing in front of it and refusing to step aside. Clara kept working for a moment. "You saved them too," she said. "I fixed fences. You stood in a church full of people who had decided they already knew you and told them the truth about yourself." She looked at him. "That's not fixing fences. That's the hardest thing a person can do." He looked at her. "You know," she said carefully, "the truth is, they saved me too. Coming here, taking them in. Before that, I was just—" She paused. "I was maintaining, going through the days. Robert died and I kept the house running and I told myself that was enough. And then Thomas sat on my front step in a coat that didn't fit and looked at me like hope was a thing he wasn't sure he was allowed to have." She set down her own tool. "And I thought, if I can be the person who makes that look wrong, if I can be the person who says yes, hope is something you're allowed, then maybe I can be more than someone just maintaining." Elias was very still. "You understand that?" she said. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." The light had gone almost completely gold now. Below them, through the window, Daniel's voice rose in something high and pleased, and Thomas laughed at whatever it was. And Ruth said something sharp and funny that set off a round of noise from all of them. Clara listened to the sound of it. Then Elias reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the steady, deliberate grasp of a man who has made a decision and is making it plainly, and held it there on the roof of the house that now bore her name in the last light of a January evening. While below them 7 children filled the air with exactly the kind of sound that neither of them had known they were building toward. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They just stayed there side by side in the cold and the gold light, holding on. And for the first time in more years than either of them could honestly count, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.